Hello and welcome to today's Middle East Report. In this program today we'll be talking about the I.D.F, known as the Israeli Defense Force, and the moral ethics of the Israeli army in the way that they confront Islamist terrorist organizations. Warm welcome to the program, and we're very blessed to have two distinguished guests all the way from Israel. My first guest is Israeli Major, Reserve Major General Gershon Hacohen. So welcome to the program. It's the first time I've had on this program the pleasure to interview a leading Israeli military general. So thank you very much for being on the program. Also joined by Professor Asa Kasher from the University of Tel Aviv, who specializes in philosophy and military ethics. So gentlemen, welcome to the program. I'll first start off with you, Gershon. Now you have an incredible distinguished military career as a Major General in the Israeli Army. Can you share with us some stories about your life serving at the highest levels of the Israeli Army?
I'll tell you a story from days that I was absolutely young, less than 18 years old, October 73 war. I just joined the service as 17 and a half year. And we have been busy in the last day of October War in the west side of Suez Canal in cleaning off the territory. A lot of Egyptian commando have been there, and with an APC we found ourselves in dead end in the Suez Canal water. Both sides, cornfields, and my commander, the sergeant, I was a young soldier, ordered the driver to make a circle to go back just to cross the field. And the Egyptian farmer there shouted and jumped that he wanted to protect his field. And it was a war. What is a corn among all other troubles in that war? And I shouted upon my commander, we are not in a trouble, nobody's shooting against us, we can just go in reverse and save his field. And he shouted upon me, I shouted upon him. At the end it was okay. I went down from the APC, directed the APC backward in reverse, and I wrote that to my grandfather that he was one of the pioneers, came 100 years ago with Trumpeldor, worked in the Galil as a farmer. And with that letter he went to the synagogue. He read this letter to all the audience in the synagogue, and he said, "It is my education that I enforce him to walk under the trees in my orange field, and due to that he can really appreciate and respect the work of others, and to give them the respect even in time of war."
Amazing. That's incredible. Incredible. And Professor Asher, now you're a university lecturer at Tel Aviv University in military ethics and philosophy. Where did your passion for and interest in military ethics and philosophy stem from?
Okay, let me start a few steps earlier. I was born during World War II, which means under British mandate.
Amazing.
In Jerusalem. And my birth certificate is in English with a crown. And there are regulations concerning first names. And Asa is a famous descendant of King David. It's a king in the Bible. and my parents loved the name, so they decided to use it for me. But how do you spell it? Okay, according to the British mandate regulations, I think it applies to other places as well, to the United Kingdom itself. You ought to use the King James Authorized Version of the Bible when the name appears in the Bible.
Absolutely.
Now, as it happens, Asa in King James Authorized Version of the Bible is spelled with one S, not with two. So all the world spells it with two S's, but I represent the authorized version of the Bible because this is what the king told us to do. And so people call me Asa or all kinds of other forms, but Asa is my name. Let me tell you something about my last name, Kasher. In Eastern Europe and Central Europe, I mean, there were communities who elected their officials in a indirect way, like what the Americans did recently during the electors. So the community did not elect the president and other officials. They elected intermediate electors, who in turn elected the officials, and the intermediate electors were proper people, honest, running for no job, being interested just in, in morality and ethics and the prosperity of the community, and they were called kasher. Their job was called to be a kasher, meant to be an elector in a Jewish community, electing the officials. And they were very trustworthy, and they were moral and ethical. So that's the source of my passion for morality. It's in my name, actually. But to say, to put it differently, I belong to the first generation of children of Israel.
Amazing.
I remember that Israel was established. My father was fighting in the north in some infantry brigade, and I heard the ceremony of establishing the state of Israel, and I heard them telling us that now there is a Jewish state, and my mother cried, and I was that high. So I remember it, and it's in my blood, so to speak, that it's not self-evident, first of all, that there is a Jewish state, because I remember being under British mandate. I didn't suffer from it, but it's a completely different situation. And secondly, to establish a state is not to conduct a ceremony. To establish a state is to contribute to hundreds of projects of creating from scratch the institutions of a real state. So I always ask myself, as a professor of philosophy, what can I do for my state? And whenever the state is interested in my contribution, I do it. So I've been involved in writing something like 50 codes of ethics. Presently, I work for the Ministry of Defense and for the police. And I do it just because they asked me to do it, and I love doing it. I think it's fascinating. It's a philosophical project. It's interesting. It can contribute to raising the moral and ethical standards of such large institutions. And in this sense, I'm a Zionist. Okay, I am clearly for the idea of the independence of Jews in their own state. And in establishing a state, it is exemplary on every level possible.
Yeah, and Gershon, there is no doubt that you are an Israeli warrior, and the amount of battles and wars that you've been in are probably absolutely incredible. But you're also responsible for overseeing Israel's disengagement from Gaza in 2005. Can you share with us that experience, but also the willingness of Israel to sacrifice Jewish communities in a sacred land in order to try and achieve peace?
The decision to make that was made by the Prime Minister, Sharon. My job was not to deliberate about the correctness of that.
Yeah.
I was that time commanding the 36th Division. It is the most powerful ordinary division in active duty. And ordinarily we are located in the north, but we have been sent down to the south, and of course we demanded to create a very huge essential metamorphosis. It is not to engage with an enemy. The main engagement was with our brothers, part of them really my real brothers that have been there. And to do that by using force, but with a lot of constraints. And it demanded a creation of a unique operational attitude from the basic operational idea to the battle procedures of the combatants, policemen and soldiers. And thank God we had time to prepare ourselves for that, to prepare it conceptually and by organizing the appropriate structure of the forces, and also to create a daily friction and engagement by speaking with the people there, by the awareness, deep awareness that we are going to do that, because the order was that until September, no Jews, no settlements, no military assets or infrastructure will remain there. This is very physical, well defined. But the main purpose was to do that by avoiding a civil war in Israel among brothers, and to do that without bloodshed. This was, in a way, a miracle, not just by me.
But also very sad when we see that Israel unilaterally withdrew from the Gaza Strip, uprooting something like 9,000 Jewish homes and settlements, including synagogues in Gaza. And now that situation in Gaza has become intolerable because it's given the opportunity for Hamas to overthrow Fatah and actually control the Gaza Strip. And now it's become almost an enemy territory, and I mean that by having Hamas's rockets and missiles and their terror tunnels. It's become a terror state, as it were, right on Israel's border. In hindsight, do you think that Sharon's government, by implementing the disengagement plan, actually created a major problem for Israel's security now?
The outcome could be judged whether it is what really was desired or not, of course. We can't ask Sharon whether it is what he expected, but to explain it from just the necessity to construct a rationale for Sharon, anyhow, he couldn't give a guarantee that after that a peace will emerge from what we are going. So I think what he wanted to do is to create an initiation that with an Israeli act initiated by the Israelis, we will create a kind of new emerging phenomena. Something will happen, either or. Either maybe a good desired result will come out as peace, or at least tranquility in that arena. That could be satisfied everybody. Or if the wrong trend will come out, then it could create a different arrangement of the whole arena. And by that, we will see what to do next according to what emerged from that. So it means he didn't want just one well-defined end state. He didn't write that. Ben-Gurion, for example, wrote with deep awareness about his deliberation. There are no diaries of Sharon, what he really had in mind. This is my construction. That the end state was not, for example, to get peace, and then we can judge it to say 3 operations have been enforced upon Israelis after that disengagement. It means it was wrong because it didn't bring the desired end state. Or to bring something that is catastrophe, it is also not what he defined as an end state, what he defined, I think, is to do something. And we will see what will happen from that and adapt ourselves to what will happen. And I think that what happened, giving a lesson of what really endangering the existence of Israel. If another process like that would enforce upon the Israelis without the demanded security arrangements. Absolutely. From Judea and Samaria.
And Professor...
May I add a word?
Of course, absolutely. Yes, of course, absolutely.
Issue. I mean, you can't compare the dreams of peace with the Palestinians with the result of disengagement. However, you should do the comparison in a broader way. I mean, what would have happened in that area had we not been involved in this engagement? Okay, so here are 8,000 or 9,000 people. They live amongst the Palestinians of the Gaza Strip. They are constantly attacked. You needed a vision to protect them, perhaps more. And so this is also a horrible situation. I'm not saying that this engagement was right or wrong professionally, but the grand evaluation must take into account the impossible. I mean, there were daily casualties among the settlers and among soldiers when we were there. So at certain points, a state can take a step towards, which is significant towards its own citizens by evacuating those who are there, but by that protecting them much better and protecting some other people within Israel in what looked at the time a better way.
Yeah. My professional attitude is different, but I think it is better not to really enter to these details. Yeah. But actually, the same division that protected inside Gaza is protected the settlement along the border now, and 3 operations that we had to lead after could raise a question: what is better, daily friction in small scale, or jumping operations, huge operations that bringing Israelis to lose international legitimation, like Goldstone research and conclusions, and other troubles? I myself knowing to explain why the daily small friction is better.
Yeah. And Professor Asher, I have to ask you, in terms of military ethics, now I heard quite an incredible talk carried out by Colonel Richard Kemp of the British Armed Forces, in which he said that the way that Israel conducts asymmetrical warfare against terrorist organizations like Hamas in Gaza, that now the United States government and the British government are learning from Israel's experience because of Israel's moral code and ethics. Now, what are the challenges facing the Israeli army before mounting a military operation like the one we saw in the summer of 2014 against Hamas in Gaza? Okay,
Israel is interested in peace. But if Israel is being attacked by Hamas or Hezbollah or someone else, then it defends itself. But it is mandatory to defend yourself as a member of the family of nations, which means by observing the Hague Convention, the Geneva Conventions, and other ones. Now, those conventions are directly and relatively easily applicable to ordinary wars. When we fought the Syrians or the Egyptians, then the Geneva Convention could be applied quite easily. Not that everyone complied with it. I mean, the attitude towards prisoners of war, for example, was horrible on the part of our enemies. But by and large, there was a framework. Now, when you look at the activities, the mode of activity of the terrorist organizations in southern Lebanon and in Gaza, you cannot simply apply the conceptions and the distinctions that used to be applied earlier and are demanded by international law. Take the simplest and the most important one, perhaps, is the principle of distinction. The principle of distinction, by the way, I mean, since we are here on this radio, on this television station, let me mention that it stems from St. Augustine and from St. Thomas Aquinas. Just for international, present-day international law is just a legal framework that represents the major ideas of the so-called just war doctrine that started with those two important thinkers. And one of the principles that the just war doctrine introduced and international law adopts is the distinction between combatants and non-combatants. It's just a derivative of a more general distinction, a more general principle. If there is war, peace is better than war, but if there is war, alleviate the calamities of war, minimize damages. And one major way of trying to minimize damages is to leave the non-combatants aside. My non-combatants and your non-combatants are not in the hostilities, just the combatants of both parties. So that's a very important and deep way of trying to minimize the damages caused by war, which is death and injury and destruction and everything. So we draw a distinction between combatants and non-combatants. Our combatants wear a uniform. It states I.D.F. They wear their guns openly. They comply with the rules. They don't launch rockets on Gaza or things like this. Whereas our enemies completely blur the distinction between combatants and non-combatants. First of all, they act from residential areas, not from bases or positions, from residential areas. Secondly, they blur the distinction with respect to the targets. I mean, they launch rockets over Israeli places freely. They don't mind whether it's a military base or a kibbutz or something. So they ignore that kind of important distinction. So you have to fight against terrorists that jeopardize the life of your own citizens when that terrorist is acting from a residential area. If you hit him, then usually it's him. If you hit him, then probably you'll hit his neighbors. His neighbors are not dangerous. They're non-combatants. So if you don't hit him, then your citizens are going to be hit. So there is always the necessity to be involved in the so-called considerations of proportionality, which also stem from the same just war doctrine, which means look at the advantage, the military advantage you gain by doing something. Look at the price in terms of collateral damage. That's the double effect doctrine. The Catholic double effect doctrine is exactly this doctrine. Okay, you compare the benefits with the prices. Those prices are in human terms. So you are allowed to cause collateral damage in a military activity just if the contribution of your military activity to the end result of the war, namely stopping the hostilities of your enemy and by that defending your own citizens, justifies it. So sometimes it does not justify the activity and you don't do it. And you wait for another occasion for destroying a certain magazine of rockets. But sometimes you have to cause collateral damage. What we do is that we have very developed methods. And this is what Colonel Kemp referred to. We have very developed methods for minimizing damages, collateral damages. I'll give you just, two brief examples. Every battalion commander has on his staff a population officer, so-called, which ought to know the whereabouts of the non-combatants in the area in which that battalion commander is going to work. So estimating the danger of causing collateral damage is not just, intuitive evaluations done by some commander who has thousands of things on his mind. It's done by a professional officer whose job is to know exactly where are those non-combatants and to inform the battalion commander, let alone the division commander and others. So you have persons whose job is exactly this, to help the commanders to minimize collateral damage. Another example I can give is related to, we have a squadron of light planes. When the Air Force acts above Gaza during the Operation Protective Edge, whenever an Air Force mission was conducted by the plane or helicopter or whatever, there was a light plane in the area as well. Because during planning of the Air Force activity, they made assumptions concerning what is going on around the target, right? And they ought to know what's going on because of proportionality. Now assume that the environment of the target has changed. A yellow bus appeared of nowhere. And now near the target are 50 pupils in their bus. So you get the knowledge from that light plane. And
it is under control from the beginning to the end.
And on grounds of what you're being told by that light plane, you may, and sometimes ought, abort the mission. Now, 20% of the missions during Operation Protective Edge were aborted, Air Force missions, were aborted because of information coming from from that squadron, which means that we took into account the obligation to minimize damages, minimize casualties among the neighbors of the terrorists so seriously that, 20%, it's not one here and one there. It's a significant number. It affects the way you fight. Yes, it affected the way we fought for saving human life.
Absolutely. And
I must give in addition an example. Asa really explains that excellently, and the procedures are very clear, and there are targets that will never be attacked without informing the chief of staff himself to get permission. It is not just the decisions in the field, but to make a clear example about how we are finding ourselves in the dilemma coming out from the vanished distinction between combatants and civilians. It was in 2001, times that we can call it Second Intifada. In Tulkarm was a medical doctor with the name Tabet Tabet, and he led a group of terrorists. At night, he was dealing with commanding the terrorist attacks. At morning, he was going to his clinic. At the end, he was, we can call that killed or assassinated, depends upon point of view. In his way at morning, he was assassinated by special forces in his way to his clinic. So who was killed? A leader of a terrorist or a medical doctor? Actually, at the morning, he was a medical doctor. That occasion really exemplifying that we are in a different phenomena that what this really described and can be leading us according to the Geneva Convention.
If I may add one or two sentences to this idea. It's not that we act this way because of international pressure, because of public opinion, because of the President of the United States emotions and things like this. We act this way because this is what we are, and you can see it in our values. Absolutely. In the Code of Ethics of the I.D.F., there is a value called human life, which means, roughly speaking, the sanctity of human life, yes. The preciousness of it. You don't kill if it's not a necessity. You try to avoid killing people if possible when you have to defend your own citizens. Then we have a value called, we call it it's a Hebrew historical term, purity of arms. What it really means is restraint of force. Whereas restraint of force in many armies means acting by law, we mean by moral standards, which means restrain your force. Just do what is necessary for the mission. And then we have a basic fundamental value in Israel, not only in the I.D.F. but elsewhere too, indeed, which is protecting human dignity. So protecting human dignity, which means you need a justification for for doing something which has a major effect on a person. For example, killing him. So you need a very good justification for killing a certain terrorist. Okay, if you can capture him, why kill him? Capture him. It's better for the intelligence as well.
Absolutely.
But you need justification for killing his neighbor. And the only justification is that, well, there is an ongoing attack on us. We cannot stop it without hitting the terrorists. So we warn the neighbors using different methods, and he's still there. So unfortunately, he might get killed.
Major General Gershon, I have to ask you, when you first signed up for the I.D.F. and you involved in Israel's last conventional warfare, which was the Yom Kippur War, in which Israel was engaged in a struggle against Egypt and also Syria in the north, how has the nature of warfare changed now that we're dealing with Islamist terrorist organizations that don't follow for example, the Geneva Convention?
Of course.
They use
They are doing that
women and children as
intentionally
human
because
and
they
children.
are trying to make all exploitation of the fact that they are not enforced to obey these laws. But it is not only the problem of the Israelis. By that, we are not even the pioneers, because all the warfare in the world was just taking that change. Take what's going on now in Mosul. Just imagine that tomorrow the battle is over and we are facing victory. What could be the outcome? Is it like in 1945 in Berlin that the war was over just by demolishing the Nazi regime? Not at all, because ISIS is an idea, creating metamorphosis changes. So you can demolish the forces of ISIS in this city, Mosul, or tomorrow maybe in Raqqa, and you can find a new kind of metamorphosis, creating a new challenge. So the war is not really ended. It is an open-ended challenge.
Absolutely. And in terms of the threats and the strategic threats that Israel faces, now, ever since the Arab Spring or the Arab Winter that we saw in 2010, we've seen the old borders of the Middle East start to disappear and new borders emerge. And with that, new threats, and you mentioned the threat posed by the Islamic State, ISIS in both Syria and also in Iraq, and a problem throughout the region of the Middle East of Islamic extremism, but also Iran. Can I ask you, since the Iran agreement over Iran's nuclear weapons program, has the Iranian regime been active in plots and in campaigns of terrorist attacks against Israel and been planning those sort of attacks?
Maybe not directly, but just look what happened with the revolution forces commanded by Qassami. They are working in Yemen. They are supporting the battlefield against ISIS in Mosul. They are guiding the Syrians in the war in Syria. They are, of course, supporting Hezbollah. They are proxy of them in huge alliances. And they are always trying to create a permanent instability. It's not only the nuclear threat that they are preparing, coming to that preparation or another, doesn't matter now. It is the logic that in order to keep the momentum of the revolution, that the revolution must go on. It is not a revolution that ended and now time for daily prosperity. They want prosperity in their own terms and to keep the momentum of revolution, to deliver it to other regions. So actually, I'll just give you an example. I visited the Iranian pavilion in Expo Shanghai several years ago. In the line you are waiting to enter to the Iranian pavilion, huge map from time of Daryavish, the Persian king, to present that what it is all about. Persian was a global empire at that time. And in a way, they are coming to be a very important force in the whole region.
Absolutely. Let's have a look now at Colonel Richard Kemp talking about the morality of the I.D.F. in conducting military operations against Islamist terrorist organizations like Hamas in Gaza.
I spent 30 years in the British Army fighting exactly the kind of terrorism and extremism that Israel faces today. I fought in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in the Balkans, and various other places in the Middle East. Therefore, the kind of challenges and threats that Israel faces are very, very familiar to me. The way that this conflict has been portrayed in many, many media outlets, by many reporters, by some politicians around the world, is the mirror opposite of reality. Israel has been demonized, Israel has been accused of committing war crimes. The real war crimes here have been committed by Hamas. Hamas initiated the conflict.
The bodies of 3 missing Israeli teens have been found. You may remember they disappeared June 12th near a settlement in the West Bank.
And now a senior Hamas leader living in exile in Turkey is claiming that Hamas was responsible for the deaths of those 3 Israeli teens.
Israelis running for shelter in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, seeking safety from Hamas rockets launched from Gaza, now a daily occurrence across Israel.
It's called Lower Gaza, the network of tunnels built by Hamas that snake their way from Gaza into Israel. This terrifying attack shows Hamas militants attacking Israeli soldiers after surfacing from a tunnel in Israel.
Israel had no choice but to respond. That Hamas wished to use their people as human sacrifices, as human shields. Numerous cases we've seen of UN schools being used to store weapons in, to attack I.D.F. forces.
Hamas has not only been using mosques, but even a church compound to attack Israeli citizens.
Well, the United Nations says they did find some weapons, Hamas weapons, in a United Nations school. Not the first time they say this has happened.
We're seeing Hamas setting up for a rocket launch just meters away from our hotel, and again, as I point out, bang in the middle of what is a residential area full of hotels.
The whole purpose of Hamas's human shield strategy is to have the death of their own people, which means that Israel is always the bad guy. No matter what it does, it is always the bad guy in the world.
This continued killing of women and children in a way that appears to be indiscriminate is asinine.
I listen to the policies of senior officers, of generals, of colonels in the I.D.F, and the policies that they pass down forbid their soldiers from carrying out attacks against a target when there are innocent civilians in the target zone.
If
there are civilians there, they will take action to remove the civilians, and they will do that by radio messages, by text messages, by dropping leaflets.
Leaflets were dropped by the Israeli Defense Forces over the course of the day, warning residents that they would target Hamas targets.
Israel has taken enormous steps to prevent the deaths of innocent civilians, far more than many other armies would take. What we've seen is a fixation with the Gaza conflict. Now, what's gone on there is extremely tragic, but at the same time, almost unnoticed, and certainly largely ignored by the media, has been the continued killing in Syria. We've had fighting in Yemen, in Nigeria, in many other East African countries, in Iraq. Many, many Christians have been butchered, and others have been attempts to force them to convert or drive them out of the country. We haven't seen any protests even remotely like the protests that we're seeing around the world against what's been happening in Gaza. The one conflict that the world seems more concerned about than any other is the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. And this is not a coincidence. It's not because there is particular concern among certain sections of society about Palestinian Arabs being killed. This is all about who is doing the fighting, and it's all about anti-Israel. Israel should not be lectured by any country in the world about its humanity. Israel is an extremely humane country. It's a Western liberal democracy, and it's as strong in its morality, it's strong in its ethos, as its human ethos, as any other country in the world. And although I'm not Israeli and I'm not Jewish, I find it personally insulting to hear Israel abused in this way. I believe that the evil of violent Islamic jihad is an evil that faces the entire Western world.
Hamas is ISIS, ISIS is Hamas. They're the enemies of peace. They're the enemies of Israel. They're the enemies of all civilized countries.
The destruction of the state of Israel is not Hamas' final destination.
Hamas' final destination is building the Islamic Khilafah, which means an Islamic state on the rubble of every other civilization.
This is not just a fight that Israel's fighting, it's a fight that affects all of us. Israel is actually at the front line of the fight, and Israel deserves our support at the front line, because you can be certain that the terror that's being aimed at Israel will be aimed at our own countries next.
And those were the very powerful and inspiring words of Colonel Richard Kemp, who was in charge of British military intelligence in Afghanistan. Professor Asher, I have to ask you, considering the morality of the I.D.F., and particularly when Israel carries out operations against terrorist organizations, either Hezbollah or Hamas, and does everything she can to avoid civilian casualties, why does the Western governments, why does the British government, the European government, the United States and our world media believe the lies of Israel's enemies?
First of all, I think that there are traces of a change. And unfortunately, those changes happen after a state and its population suffer from some terror activity. I mean, the United States used to talk against our activities against terrorists in a way that has been eliminated since September 11. The UK, France, Spain, and other states now speak about our activities in a different language. One has to understand that the way we fight terrorism is on a par with the way Western countries fight terrorism. We are not, there is no huge gap between our ways of doing it and the American or British or Canadian ways of doing it. We do some components of it better than others. We invest more efforts in minimizing collateral damage and things like this. But everyone who really attacks us attacks the way the West acts against terrorists. I mean, I'm not speaking about Iraq. I'm speaking about Afghanistan and other fights against terrorism. So the question is, why do they single out Israel? Whereas Israel fights the same way that the United States and the United Kingdom fight the terrorists and insurgents. And so there must be something deep there. So parts of it are, let's call it tactical. Okay, who is exactly the reporter of a certain British newspaper who tells people what has happened in Gaza? Okay, it's a Palestinian in Gaza who is going to get a bullet behind his eyes if he does not report in a way that the Hamas like. So what kind of a reporter is it? But they rely on reports, so-called, which are not reliable at all. This is one part of the picture, but there is one cannot avoid it, anti-Semitism. I mean, criticizing the policies of Israel is perfectly all right. I also do it every once in a while. Criticizing the general policy of Israel concerning the settlements, things like this, is perfectly legitimate. Saying that Israel should not have existed, I mean, the Balfour, UK should apologize for the Balfour Declaration, is something else. Now, why shouldn't the Jews as a nation, as a people, have the right that the Turkish and the Greek and the Finns and the Swedes have? I mean, here it's anti-Semitism. It's some kind of anti-Semitism. And when you take this underground anti-Semitism and you combine it with the passion showed by Muslim radicals, for whom the end of the caliphate justifies all means, then you get that kind of concentration upon the activities of Israel. And the media are simply irresponsible. I mean, they should have acted. I mean, now, if the media is not simply entertainment, if the media are really reporting, trying to inform you in a professional and honest way, then they should have acted completely different.
Yeah. And Major General Gershon, what are the challenges facing Israel when it comes to allowing journalists access to Israeli military operations?
We are doing that. But the main challenge is how to protect their life. It is dangerous, really. Therefore, at the beginning of engagement, it is really dangerous. But after we are really giving them direct access, as Tom Roberts, for example, made a very breaking through movie. It was called The Ugly War. It was made in 2001 by BBC. And I know him because I saw another documentary movie of him. It's called The Valley, about Kosovo. And he got access to the special operations of elite units like reconnaissance unit of Golani in 2001. And it is a very professional a documentary movie with a capability to judge yourself. Who is a bad guy, if there is a bad guy, who is a good guy. And it is not about who is a bad, who is a good. It is to leave the audience observing the program to decide, but it is about how it is managed.
Let me add a source very briefly.
Of course.
After Operation Protective Edge, a committee of high-ranking officers, really high-ranking officers, was created, consisting of something like, I don't know, a dozen officers, non-Jewish, not Zionists, not Israelis, have nothing to do with those corners, and it was headed by a former chief of staff of the German military forces, and they came to Israel and got access to everything. They saw the Minister of Defense, they saw the chief of staff, they saw the battalion commanders who had participated in the Operation Protective Edge, and they published a report. In their report, a professional, highly professional. I mean, nobody reported about their report, interestingly enough. But you can get it on the internet, and if you read the report, I mean, Israel acted quite well, as required by international law, but set its own standards higher than the standards required by international law. And at the final page of the report, they say, some of us think that the standards set by Israel are so high that if they are adopted by everyone, it would be much more difficult to fight terrorism effectively. So our standards are, every professional person who looks at it from the inside and knows what he's talking about, I mean, admits that they are very high and they are the right ones.
Absolutely. I just give in addition, why the Russians and the Syrians are bombing neighborhoods full with civilians in Halab, for example, in I.D.F.
Yes.
I.D.F. Why? Because the demands of the battlefield enforcing them to make again the distinction between the civilians that giving the protection for the warriors, to the terrorists, and how they can do that by bombing and forcing them to run away. Therefore, we are witnessing today the dilemma of more than 14 million refugees from Syria. If the Israelis would behave like that, it was not only an earthquake in the international community, it was an earthquake inside Israel. The pilots themselves would react because most of them are reservists. So we are not at all beginning to think like that.
Yeah, we're down to the last 3 minutes of the program, so just very quickly, I have to ask you really, Gershon, how proud are you to be a major general in the Israeli army and having under your command incredibly brave and courageous men and women who are passionate about defending and protecting the one Jewish state in the world that is the State of Israel?
Of course, it's not just to be proud. I'm aware about the tremendous achievement of the Zionistic movement in mainly two efforts. One, to build what we can find already in Israel with a great prosperity and what was emphasized before. And the other phenomena is that the Jews took responsibility to defend themselves. And the I.D.F. is a revolutionary process in the existence of the Jewish people.
Amazing. Amazing. Gentlemen, I just want to say it's an absolute pleasure to have you both on this programme, and for the incredible work that you both do. And Gershon, your incredible work in protecting the nation of Israel and making it as strong as it is, and also for you, Professor Asher, in actually developing the military ethics and the code of conduct for the IDF and Israel's armed forces, which is unequal to any other army in the world. And the British Army, I'm sure, and the American forces could learn so much from Israel's ways that they tackle and confront terrorism. So thank you very much for being on the program.
Thank you.
And I just want to thank you for watching today's Middle East Report, where we actually talk about having two very special guests here all the way from Israel. And one thing, if you've watched this program, one thing you would have learned is the high moral ethical code of the IDF and the preparations that are painstakingly difficult in military situations to carry out before carrying out a military attack, for example, on the Islamist terrorist organization in Hamas in Gaza, to make sure there are no civilians nearby, doing everything they can to prevent collateral damage. And you heard it yourself here from Colonel Richard Kemp on the clip that we showed, that Israel leads the way in conducting wars in ethics and morality that the rest of the world could actually learn from. So instead of attacking Israel, let's embrace Israel by saying this is what the Israelis have to do in order to protect their citizens from the horrendous potential terrorist attacks from Hamas and Hezbollah and other Islamist terrorist organizations. So I'm going to leave you with a song. So let's all pray for the wonderful work of the IDF and those serving in Israel's defense forces.
גדולת ימינך תתיר צרומה קבל רינה עמך סגבנו תארנו גדולת ימינך תתיר צרומה קבל רינת עמך סגרנו תארנו לגיבור דורשי חוכמך כמבט שערים רחם דרם רחמי צדקתך חסין קדוש באור טובך נאל עדך יחיד ואל המחפש זוכה קדושתך שרתנו גבר ושמע צעקתנו Save